My husband said to my mother-in-law, "That fat, lazy woman disgusts me. I'm only interested in her money." I heard every word through the cracked parlor door. "Mom, she disgusts me. I'm only in it for the money." Her laugh, his mother's, was ice in a crystal glass. "Then smile until you inherit, Daniel." I didn't drop the envelope I was holding. I didn't gasp. I adjusted my bracelet, turned, and climbed the Greenwich staircase like I had somewhere gentle to be. I didn't. I had a plan. How do you erase a decade without leaving fingerprints? How do you sell a $2 million house in less than 24 hours? How do you vanish without becoming a headline? Or worse, his alibi. Most people think leaving is about packing bags. It's not. It's about packing silence. It's about learning to smile through betrayal so convincingly that the people who broke you never realize you've stopped breaking. That night, while he slept beside me, the same man who called me disgusting, I lay awake listening to his steady breathing, wondering how long it would take for him to notice when the air he breathes no longer belongs to me. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows like a whisper, reminding me that freedom doesn't come wrapped in courage. It comes disguised as exhaustion, the kind that makes you stop explaining yourself to people who never deserved an explanation. Before sunrise, I opened my laptop. By the time the city lights faded, the wheels were already turning. Discreet calls, unsigned emails, private buyers, lawyers who specialized in quiet disappearances. Every move I made had to be perfect. No paper trail, no emotion, no witnesses. Because when a man tells his mother he's only interested in your money, you don't confront him. You make sure he never sees another cent of it again. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 41 years old. Born in Atlanta, raised between Boston and New Haven, and thanks to my late father's quiet fortune, I became the reluctant owner of a mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, a place where appearances were a form of currency and silence was the price of entry. I never truly fit there. In every charity gala and polished dinner, I was the woman whose presence filled the room but never quite belonged. A black woman in old money circles, graceful, educated, yet constantly measured by people who mistook thinness for class and cruelty for sophistication. I was the one they politely called elegant when I entered a room, and brave once I left it. Behind those smiles, they whispered the same line over and over, that I was the fat wife who got lucky. But I wasn't lucky. I was disciplined. I was careful. I carried a legacy that generations before me had built with quiet dignity and work the world never credited them for. And then there was Daniel Carter. He was 7 years younger, handsome in a political poster sort of way. The kind of man who never looked at you, just passed you, as if you were part of the background of his ambitions. When we met, I thought he saw me. Now I know he saw through me, straight to the inheritance he could use to sculpt his image. He had a politician's smile, a strategist's mind, and a heart colder than the marble floors of that house we shared. His mother, Vivian Carter, was the architect of his charm and his cruelty. A woman who treated empathy like a weakness and status like religion. She wore pearls that caught the light at every luncheon, but her words could slice steel. She once told me, "Women like you should be grateful to be chosen. The world doesn't often give second chances to generosity." She didn't mean generous. She meant large. For 10 years, we performed our marriage like professionals. Publicly, we were perfect, poised, smiling, and neatly tragic in the way glossy magazines adore. Privately, it was a transaction. He brought charisma, I brought credibility. He brought the speeches, I paid for the microphones. We didn't argue much. There was nothing left to fight for. Just long, elegant silences broken by calendar reminders and photo op rehearsals. Sometimes I'd catch him rehearsing in the mirror, the concerned tilt of the head, the compassionate pause, the press-ready grin, the performance of a man people wanted to vote for. But behind the camera lights, there was only contempt. And still, I stayed. Not out of love, but out of habit. Habit is a quiet prison. You start decorating your cell until it looks like home. There were moments, fleeting, deceptive moments, when I thought he might still have some good left in him. When he touched my hand at dinner just long enough to remind me of the early days, the laughter, the spontaneous trips, the way he used to trace my fingers and say, "You have the hands of a woman who builds things." I didn't realize I was one of the things he planned to build, and then dismantle when it suited him. The irony was, everyone saw the cracks before I did. My friends stopped visiting. They said the house felt sterile, like a museum where everything was staged and nothing was lived in. They were right. Every piece of art on the wall, every imported vase, every carefully folded napkin, all curated for image. Not one thing reflected me. The mansion was worth $2 million, but it might as well have been built from ice. I'd wake up at 2 a.m., walk barefoot through the hallways, and wonder who I was performing for. The woman in the framed photos smiled like she had it all together. But the woman behind the camera lens was quietly dissolving. And yet, I still believed that if I just tried harder, if I dressed better, lost more weight, gave more money, hosted one more fundraiser, maybe, just maybe, Daniel would finally see me again. But he never did. Because men like Daniel don't see women. They see mirrors, and when the reflection stops flattering them, they break the glass. When I overheard those words in the parlor, "That fat, lazy woman disgusts me. I'm only interested in her money," something inside me didn't shatter. It clicked, like a lock opening after years of pretending to be stuck. That was the moment I realized I didn't need to scream or beg. I just needed to disappear. And the only sound they'd hear would be the echo of a door closing behind me. It was Daniel's birthday. The mansion smelled of jasmine, brewed coffee, and the kind of silence that money buys. The silence that covers everything rotten beneath the marble floors. I had been up since dawn, directing the staff, arranging the table, choosing the music. Everything had to look perfect. The white orchids, the imported pastries, the monogrammed napkins, even the champagne was chilled to the exact temperature he preferred. I told myself it was love. But looking back, I realize it was just training. I had been conditioned to serve the illusion. The private chef moved like a soldier in a parade. He plated the brioche, adjusted the strawberries, nodded politely, careful not to meet my eyes for too long. Even the staff had learned what I hadn't. Perfection was a weapon in this house, not a comfort. At exactly 10:16 a.m., I came down the grand staircase holding 2 gifts, a Rolex he'd wanted for months, and an envelope containing a $100,000 donation made in his name to a National Children's Foundation. It was supposed to make him smile. Daniel loved seeing his name attached to generosity, especially when cameras were around. But that morning, the dining room was empty. His seat was untouched. His coffee cup was still clean. Then I heard it, voices drifting from the adjacent parlor. I followed the sound like a ghost, barefoot, careful not to make the hardwood creak. The door was slightly ajar. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but when betrayal calls your name, you don't knock. Mom, she disgusts me. That fat, lazy woman. I'm only in it for the money. The words came out smooth, casual, as if he were describing a business deal instead of a wife. His mother, Vivian Carter, laughed softly. That high society kind of laugh that sounds like breaking glass wrapped in silk. "Then smile until you inherit, Daniel," she said. "Once everything's in your name, let her go. You deserve someone who looks better beside you on campaign posters." They clinked their coffee cups together like people sealing a contract. My hands trembled, but my face didn't move. The envelope slipped slightly between my fingers. I caught it before it hit the floor. For a moment, the air itself felt heavy. The scent of jasmine made me nauseous. The grandfather clock ticked, steady, almost cruel, counting down the seconds until the person I used to be was gone. I didn't cry. Not there. Not for them. I simply stepped back, quietly, and turned toward the staircase. Every step I climbed felt like walking out of a dream I should have woken from years ago. In my bedroom, I placed the envelope on the dresser and looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection looked calm, but my eyes had already changed. They weren't soft anymore. They were focused. I realized then that this house, this marriage, this life, it had never really been mine. It belonged to the version of me they had invented, the polite wife, the decorative success story, the quiet woman with expensive sadness. That version of me ended the moment I heard those words. By evening, the performance resumed. I came down to dinner in the blue silk dress he liked, the one that shimmered under chandelier light. I smiled. I poured the wine. I wished him happy birthday. "Naomi, you outdid yourself," Vivian said, her smile tight and false. "The wine is exquisite. You should really give my friend your dietitian's number." Daniel laughed, loud and careless, like he'd never said a cruel word in his life. I smiled too, the kind of smile that hides a war. When I handed him the Rolex box, he kissed my cheek without looking at me. A camera flash from his campaign assistant captured the moment, a perfect frozen lie. He didn't know that while he posed with that watch, I was already planning my next move. He didn't know that the woman beside him was no longer his wife, just a witness. A witness waiting for the right hour to disappear. Later that night, I stood on the balcony overlooking the garden. The air was cold and honest. For the first time, I didn't feel trapped inside the life everyone envied. I felt powerful, not because I had money, but because I was about to take it back. And as the lights of Greenwich glittered below me, I made a silent promise. They would never see me beg. They would never hear me break. And they would never again have the power to decide what I was worth. The next morning, before the world even knew I was gone, the real plan began. It was past midnight. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock down the hallway. The same clock Daniel's campaign photographer once called classic wealth aesthetics. Now it only sounded like a countdown. At 1:12 a.m., I sat at my father's mahogany desk, the one piece of furniture I refused to let Daniel replace, and opened the old leather folio he'd left me. Inside were property deeds, trust documents, and a list of quiet contacts. Men and women who specialized in cleaning up the messes of the powerful or helping them disappear when scandals got too loud. For years, I thought I'd inherited a safety net. Now I realized I'd inherited an escape route. I wasn't running from drama. I was walking out of a museum where I'd been mislabeled fortunate. I was the exhibit wife, well-dressed, well-behaved, and well-forgotten. I made 2 calls. The first was to a private buyer who'd been eyeing properties in Greenwich, the kind of man who didn't blink at cash transactions or question urgency. The second was to Mr. Keller, my father's longtime attorney in Boston, the only person who had ever spoken to me like I was a human being instead of a portfolio. "Can you handle a full transfer in under 12 hours?" I asked. He paused. "If the title's clean and the buyer's vetted, yes. Are you sure about this, Naomi?" "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. At 4:03 a.m., Keller sent over the documents. At 5:28, my digital signature slid across the screen. By 7:46 a.m., escrow confirmed the wire. And at 9:02 a.m., the transfer was complete. Just like that, the house, all $2,000 of polished emptiness, no longer belonged to the man who mocked me for paying for it. I stood in the master bedroom, sunlight bleeding through the curtains, watching the room that had once felt like a cage now look strangely peaceful. Daniel was still asleep. His body faced the window, his hand resting over the pillow where my note would be. For a moment, I studied him, not out of love, but out of curiosity. He looked harmless when unconscious. Men like him often do. On the nightstand sat the Rolex I'd given him just hours earlier. He'd tossed it there, ungrateful, like everything else I'd ever given. That watch would be worth less than the paper my note was written on. I took a pen, the same gold one from our wedding guest book, and wrote slowly, carefully, so the words would sting without bleeding emotion. Thanks for showing your true colors. No explanation, no accusation. Just the truth, stripped bare. I folded the note and placed it on the pillow beside him. Then I packed, not suitcases, just essentials. A black leather backpack, my passport, a few plain clothes, a photograph of 18-year-old me standing on Tybee Island with my arms wide open toward a sky I used to believe belonged to me, and my father's cufflinks, the only proof left that I once came from a world with dignity. Everything else, the jewelry, the gowns, the luxury handbags Daniel loved to flaunt as proof of his generosity, I left behind. Let him have them. Let him decorate his lies with my leftovers. At 9:40 a.m., the chef was prepping brunch. Vivian's driver had just arrived. Daniel was still upstairs, pretending to dream of success. I walked through the hall quietly, my heels in my hand, the marble cold beneath my feet. The paintings on the walls, the ones Daniel insisted we hang to impress guests, stared down at me, glossy and lifeless. I passed the dining room table one last time. The white orchids I'd ordered were still fresh, their scent clinging to the air like memory. I leaned in, inhaled deeply, and whispered to myself, "This is the last thing they'll ever smell of me." I stepped out through the service door, the one the staff used to bring in groceries, and into the early morning mist. The hedges were trimmed into perfect symmetry, the kind of order Daniel craved in a world that was anything but. I walked past them without looking back. Outside, a single black car waited, not a limo, not a town car, just a discreet sedan from the buyer's courier service, holding the final set of closing papers. I signed them in the back seat, closed the folder, and exhaled. For the first time in a decade, the air didn't feel expensive. It felt mine. As the driver pulled away, the mansion faded in the rearview mirror. Tall, white, immaculate, and hollow. The life I left behind had never been a home. It was just a well-decorated cage. That morning, Daniel woke up to sunlight and silence. He reached for me out of habit. His hand touched paper instead of skin. And that's when he found the note. He read it twice, confused, then laughed the way cruel men laugh when they think they still have control. He had no idea that by the time he poured his first cup of coffee, I had already become a ghost with a full bank account and no forwarding address. For the first time in years, I smiled. Not for the cameras, not for appearances, but for myself. Because I knew the woman they mocked for her weight, her softness, her patience, was finally gone. And in her place stood someone Daniel would never see coming. The first city that felt invisible enough to hide in was Baltimore. Not the polished postcard version, the real one. Brick row houses scarred by time, alleys whispering old stories, sidewalks patched with the kind of cracks only people who've learned to survive can walk across. It wasn't home, but it was honest, and honesty, after Greenwich, felt like oxygen. I rented a month-to-month studio, nothing fancy, nothing traceable. One narrow window, a flickering bulb, a mattress that dipped in the middle. I paid in cash. No ID, no questions. When the landlord asked for my name, I hesitated for a second, then said it out loud for the first time. Maya Ellis. It wasn't clever. It wasn't symbolic. It was just new. I unpacked what little I had, a few folded clothes, my old photograph, my father's cufflinks, and the notebook where I started to write again. Not about Daniel, not about betrayal. Just words that reminded me I still existed. Simple things like, "The light through the window this morning was enough." For the first few days, I barely spoke. I walked the streets, learned the rhythm of the neighborhood, the sirens that sang at midnight, the old man who sold newspapers on the corner, the church bell that rang at odd hours even though the church had no congregation. On the third day, I passed a community kitchen on North Avenue. A handwritten sign hung crooked on the door. Volunteers welcome. No questions asked. Inside, steam rose from aluminum trays. A woman in an HBCU hoodie was running the kitchen like a battlefield commander. She shouted over the noise, directing people like she'd been born doing it. Next to her, a tall man with dark circles under his eyes was kneeling beside an old refrigerator, trying to keep it alive with a butter knife and hope. "You hiring?" I asked quietly. The woman looked up, one eyebrow raised. "We're allergic to payroll," she said, her voice quick and dry. "But we're drowning in work." Her name was Tasha Reed. She'd grown up in West Baltimore, left for a few years, then came back when no one else wanted to. She didn't care who I was or where I'd come from. She only cared whether I could chop vegetables without cutting my fingers off. The man at the fridge introduced himself as Dr. Aaron Wells, a community physician, the kind who'd rather fix broken hearts than chase headlines. His hands were calloused, his face calm, but his eyes had seen too much pain and refused to stop caring anyway. I didn't know it then, but those two strangers, Tasha and Aaron, would become the anchors of my new life. At first, I kept to simple tasks, scrubbing pots, unloading crates, mopping floors. I didn't complain. After years of elegant prisons, the smell of dish soap and steam felt holy. By the second week, I'd memorized the sound of the kitchen, the clatter of ladles, the laughter of kids, the scraping of chairs on cracked tiles. I learned that Tasha had a daughter in college and 2 part-time jobs, that Aaron spent his nights at a free clinic because no one else would take the shifts, that the people here, the ones society called the forgotten, had more grace than any of the polished donors Daniel used to court. At night, I returned to my small room and sat by the window, watching headlights smear across wet pavement. Sometimes I'd whisper my old name, Naomi, just to remind myself she had existed. But it always felt like saying goodbye. I was learning something I hadn't understood in years. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sighs quietly through a broken window and asks if you're ready to start over. Still, the fear lingered. I checked every reflection twice: store windows, passing cars, security cameras. I knew Daniel well enough to know that pride and panic can make a man dangerous. But every morning, I kept showing up at the kitchen. Tasha would nod at me without a word, hand me an apron, and point to a new stack of boxes. No introductions, no pity, just work. And for the first time in a decade, I belonged somewhere not because of my last name, but because I was useful. Aaron started trusting me with more, organizing inventory, managing supply lists, even drafting a donation letter. He noticed how neatly I wrote, how I used business phrasing without thinking. One afternoon, he looked at me over a stack of papers and said, "You write like someone who used to sign contracts worth millions." I smiled. Not millions, just enough to buy silence. He didn't ask more. He only nodded. "Well, around here, we're fresh out of silence. Hope that's not a problem." That night, I walked home with tired hands and a full heart. And for the first time since leaving Greenwich, I didn't dream of escape. I dreamed of staying. But peace, I've learned, has an expiration date, especially when the past hasn't finished with you. Baltimore taught me something Greenwich never could: the sound of ordinary life. Not the hush of money, not the rehearsed politeness of power, just people living, breathing, surviving. By my 3rd month at the North Avenue Community Kitchen, I'd stopped counting days. Mornings began with the rattle of delivery trucks, afternoons with the hiss of boiling water and Tasha's sharp voice cutting through the clamor. Every clang of a pot, every burst of laughter from the volunteers stitched me a little tighter to this new world. I wasn't Naomi Carter here. I was Maya Ellis, the woman who showed up early, stayed late, and always said thank you. Aaron started trusting me with more. He'd leave me in charge of the stockroom, the donation ledger, the boxes of expired food that needed sorting. He'd watch quietly as I organized chaos into order, then nod to himself like a man who'd finally exhaled after holding his breath for too long. "You run this place like a corporation," he joked one evening. "Old habits," I said. "Where I come from, everything had to shine, especially the lies." He smiled softly, but his eyes searched mine as if the truth was hovering just behind my words. He never pressed. Instead, he'd hand me another stack of forms or a cup of coffee and change the subject. Then came Keisha, 9 years old, skinny as a pencil, eyes wide enough to swallow the whole room. She came every afternoon for sandwiches and stories she never told. One day she tugged at my sleeve and held up a bracelet she'd made from red yarn. "It's so you don't leave," she said. I laughed, a small, surprised sound I hadn't heard from myself in years. "I already left once, sweetheart. This time I'm staying." From that day, she followed me everywhere. Tiny footsteps matching mine, tiny voice asking questions I couldn't always answer. "Were you ever rich?" "Once," I said. "Did you like it?" "No, but I liked pretending I did." The kitchen became my world. We fed the hungry, mended what we could, and ignored what we couldn't fix. At night, when the doors shut and the city's noise dimmed, I stayed behind to balance the accounts. The numbers calmed me. They made sense in a way people never did. Sometimes Aaron would linger, sitting on the counter, sleeves rolled to his elbows. "You don't sleep much, do you?" "Sleep feels expensive," I'd answer. He'd chuckle quietly, the kind of laugh that felt safe. Tasha called me the quiet hurricane. I didn't argue. She saw the way I worked when I was angry, how I scrubbed surfaces like I could erase memory. One humid night in July, a storm cut the power. We lit candles, opened the doors, and handed out bowls of soup by flashlight. The rain turned the streets into rivers. When the last person left, Aaron looked at me across the dark kitchen and said, "You ever think storms are just the sky trying to wash something clean?" "Maybe," I said. "But the sky always forgets to dry what it drowns." He looked at me for a long moment, as if cataloging every word. Then he nodded. "You've got a poet's mouth, Maya." And for a flicker of time, I almost told him my real name. Almost. But ghosts don't introduce themselves. Still, little by little, the weight of my old life began to fade. The sound of my heels on marble floors was replaced by the slap of wet shoes on cracked tile. The sterile scent of jasmine candles gave way to onions and disinfectant. And somehow, that smelled like freedom. One afternoon, Tasha found me sitting by the window during lunch break, writing in my notebook. "What's that?" she asked. "Nothing important, just thoughts." "About what?" "About being invisible," I said. She smiled. "Sometimes invisible is good. No one shoots at what they can't see." I looked down at the red bracelet on my wrist, the one Keisha made. It reminded me of everything I'd lost and everything I hadn't realized I still had. By then, 3 months had passed since the morning I left Greenwich. No headlines, no detectives at my door. Just silence, the safest sound I'd ever known. But silence has edges. One evening, while sorting donated clothes, Tasha called from the front. "Maya, someone's asking for you." A man stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, holding a clipboard. He wasn't a cop, too casual for that. He was a private investigator, though I didn't know it yet. "Sorry, miss," he said politely. "I'm looking for someone who matches your description, a missing person, from Connecticut." My stomach dropped. Tasha crossed her arms. "You think every woman with a backbone is from Connecticut? Get out before I call the pastor." The man hesitated, muttered something about wrong address, and left. I didn't breathe until his car disappeared. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window until dawn, gripping my notebook like a lifeline, repeating the same line I'd written weeks ago. Freedom isn't the absence of fear. It's walking anyway. The next morning, I went back to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. But Aaron noticed. He always did. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply handed me a cup of coffee and said, "Whatever's chasing you, it'll get tired before you do." I smiled faintly, though part of me knew the chase wasn't over, because the past has good memory. And Daniel Carter was a man who hated losing what he thought he owned. For now, though, I had work to do. A kitchen full of hungry people, a little girl waiting with a red bracelet, and a new name that, for the first time, didn't feel like a lie. Back in Greenwich, the mansion that once smelled of jasmine now smelled of panic. Daniel Carter woke to an empty bed and a note he couldn't decode. At first he thought it was a stunt, a plea for attention, something to post later with a caption about working through differences. But by noon, reality began to creep in like smoke under a locked door. He called the security staff, the gardener, even the chef. No one had seen me since dawn. The Rolex still lay on the nightstand. The envelope was gone. He found the house deed folder open, but the documents missing. That was the moment his voice cracked, not from heartbreak, but from the dawning realization that the empire he'd been building on my name might have just been sold from under his feet. He called his mother. "Mom, Naomi's gone. The house—" "What do you mean gone?" Vivian Carter's tone snapped like a whip. "I mean, everything's missing. The deed, the funds, everything." Vivian paused. "Daniel, please tell me you didn't sign joint accounts in her name." She handled most of it. It looked better for the campaign." Silence, then a hissed whisper. "You fool." By late afternoon, his phone began to ring in waves. Campaign donors. A journalist asking about a suspicious midnight sale. His finance manager leaving messages about unusual transfers to offshore accounts. Every call felt like another brick being pulled from beneath his polished life. He tried to hold a press conference that evening, smiling stiffly for cameras, claiming that his wife was simply taking a break for health reasons. But reporters are sharks. They smell blood before the wound opens. And within hours, the story changed headlines. Candidate's wife disappears after sudden $2 million mansion sale. By the next morning, national media had picked it up. People speculated everything: infidelity, fraud, kidnapping. The hashtag #Where is Naomi Carter trended for 2 days straight. Daniel hated it. He loved control, and I had taken it from him without saying a word. Vivian paced her parlor, clutching her pearls the way she used to clutch champagne glasses. "She's ruining us," she muttered. Daniel snapped back. "She's ruining me." But Vivian knew the truth. The Carters were one scandal away from exile. She called her fixer, a retired investigator named Henry Cole, who'd cleaned up society messes for decades. "Find her," she ordered, "and find the money." Henry began quietly. Flight manifests, credit reports, bank trails. He found nothing. Naomi Carter had simply dissolved into air. Meanwhile, in Baltimore, I was learning to breathe. The more chaos erupted in Greenwich, the quieter my world became. Every morning I walked the cracked sidewalks to the kitchen, red bracelet against my wrist, blending into the rhythm of a city that didn't care who I used to be. Still, the past has a way of echoing. One afternoon, as Aaron read the local paper, a headline caught his eye. "Wife of rising politician vanishes after sale of $2 million estate." He frowned, reading aloud. "Maya, you see this? Greenwich, Connecticut, wild story." I kept my head down, slicing carrots, my pulse steady but loud in my ears. He folded the paper and didn't mention it again. But I could feel his curiosity flicker like a match he hadn't struck yet. That night, the news ran a clip of Daniel standing on our former front steps, pretending to wipe tears. "We're praying for Naomi's safe return," he said to the cameras, voice trembling just enough. Vivian stood beside him, chin high, diamonds catching the flashbulbs. They looked like grieving royalty, but I knew that performance better than anyone. Tasha was watching the same broadcast from the kitchen's small TV. When my face appeared in an old charity photo, she turned toward me slowly. "Maya, that woman looks a whole lot like you." I forced a laugh. "Trust me, she's thinner and richer." She stared for another beat, then shrugged. "Well, she doesn't look half as alive." After that, I worked harder, longer hours, anything to drown out the noise coming from the television sets that glowed in every bar and laundromat. I couldn't afford to slip. Not yet. Back in Connecticut, Henry Cole traced a possible lead: a cash withdrawal from a small bank in Boston, followed by a transfer to an unlisted account. He brought it to Daniel. She moved everything, smartly. Looks like she planned this for months. Daniel slammed his fist on the table. "Then she's not missing. She's hiding, and I'll find her." Vivian watched her son rage and realized, for the first time, that he looked exactly like his father had before he left her. It wasn't grief twisting his face, it was humiliation. And humiliation, for men like Daniel, always turns to vengeance. In Baltimore, the air turned colder. Leaves fell in slow spirals across cracked streets. The city prepared for winter, and so did I. I'd begun saving again, small amounts from the grant money Aaron trusted me to handle. I told him I wanted to build something bigger than the kitchen. He smiled. "What kind of bigger?" "A place for women who have nowhere else to go," I said. "Somewhere they can start over without having to lie about their names." He nodded. "Then that's what we'll do." I didn't tell him that I already owned the blueprints, in my head, in my heart, and in a hidden folder on a second-hand laptop. I called it the Red Thread House, after the bracelet Keisha made me. It would be my redemption, my quiet rebellion against everything Daniel ever represented. But peace doesn't stay unchallenged. One late afternoon, as we were cleaning up after the dinner rush, Aaron's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Unknown number," he murmured, stepping outside to take the call. Through the window, I watched him freeze mid-sentence, his brow furrowing. When he came back, his face was unreadable. "Strange," he said. "Some guy asking about our volunteers. Said he's investigating a missing person." My stomach clenched. "What did you tell him?" "That we mind our business." He smiled faintly, but his eyes searched mine. "Do you have anything you want to tell me, Maya?" For a heartbeat, I considered it. The whole truth laid bare, my real name spoken out loud. But the image of Daniel's smirk on that TV screen stopped me. "I don't know anything about missing people," I said quietly. Aaron held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right. I'll make sure they don't bother us again." He turned away. I turned back to the sink, gripping the edge until my knuckles went white. The past wasn't finished. It had just found a new address. That night, I stood at my window watching the streetlights blink on one by one. The city looked ordinary. But beneath it, the storm was gathering. I knew Daniel, his vanity, his pride. He wouldn't stop searching. And one day soon, the world I'd rebuilt with sweat and silence would collide with the world I thought I'd left behind. But I wasn't the same woman he called lazy. I wasn't the same wife who waited for permission to speak. Now I had purpose, people, and a name that, lie or not, belonged to me. So I whispered to the darkness outside my window, "Come find me, Daniel. See what's left of the woman you thought you owned." And for the first time since I'd left Greenwich, I wasn't afraid. By the end of autumn, Baltimore had begun to feel like a cocoon. The mornings smelled of coffee and damp brick, the kind of air that carried echoes of train whistles and old secrets. I'd built routines, predictable, comforting ones. The kitchen at 8, Keisha's laughter by noon, Aaron's voice in the background, calm and steady as a heartbeat. Routine is dangerous when you're hiding. It dulls your instincts. One Friday afternoon, Tasha was hosting a neighborhood fundraiser. Tables lined the sidewalk, balloons tied to rusted rails, music pouring from a single borrowed speaker. We'd all spent days preparing. Baked goods, secondhand clothes, posters hand-painted by children who believed joy could be loud enough to drown the world. Someone took pictures, as they always do. Community joy makes people want to prove they were there. I didn't think much of it when the flash went off, or when Tasha told me, "Girl, smile for once. Nobody gonna bite." So I smiled. Just once. A real one. 2 days later, that photo appeared on a local Facebook page. Neighborhood fair. Small miracles in South Baltimore. In the background, half hidden behind a table of muffins and lemonade, stood a woman in a plain shirt, head slightly bowed, hair tucked behind one ear. It wasn't an exact likeness, but it was enough. That same evening, a sleek black SUV rolled slowly down North Avenue, its tinted windows reflecting nothing but streetlights. Inside sat Daniel Carter. Next to him, the private investigator, Henry Cole, held a tablet showing that same Facebook photo. "That's her," Daniel said quietly. Cole squinted. "Could be. Image quality's bad. We move carefully. No police, no noise." Daniel's jaw tightened. "No noise. I just want her back before the press finds her." He didn't say alive. He said back. At the kitchen, I was restocking shelves when the first whisper of danger brushed my neck, the kind of instinct that doesn't speak in words. Through the front window, I caught a flash of black paint and chrome moving too slowly to belong. My stomach clenched. Habit, maybe. Fear never really dies. It just learns new disguises. I turned to Tasha. "I'm heading out early. Tell Aaron I'll finish the reports later." "You okay?" she asked, already reading the answer in my eyes. "Yeah," I lied. "Just tired." Outside, the evening air was thick, the kind that sticks to your skin. I walked quickly, but not hurriedly. Never give fear a rhythm to follow. The SUV parked across the street idled. I felt its gaze more than I saw it. So I turned down an alley, crossed through a laundromat, came out on another block, and kept moving until my knees trembled. When I finally stopped, I was standing behind an abandoned row house, heart pounding like fists on a door. For a long time, I just listened. No engines, no footsteps, only my own breathing. He hadn't seen me. Not yet. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed on the cot in the kitchen storage room, surrounded by boxes of rice and canned beans, the scent of metal and soap, my only comfort. Aaron found me there in the morning. He didn't ask why. He just set a cup of coffee beside me and said, "Whoever it is, they didn't find what they were looking for." I stared into the cup, steam rising like ghosts. "I don't know how long I can keep living like this," I whispered. Aaron's reply was gentle. "As long as it takes to be free for real. Not just missing. Free." Across the city, Daniel was losing his mask. The investigation had already begun tightening around him. Missing funds, suspicious donors, whispers of tax fraud. Vivian stayed mostly silent now, her once perfect voice cracking when reporters called. And Henry, the private investigator, was starting to suspect his employer wasn't telling him everything. He'd tracked women before, but never one who seemed so deliberately reborn. "She's not running scared," he told Daniel. "She's rebuilding. That's harder to find." Daniel's eyes darkened. "Everyone has a weakness." "Yes," Henry said, "but hers doesn't look like money anymore." That evening, rain came again. Baltimore rain, hard and cleansing. I stood under the awning of the kitchen, letting the spray touch my hands. Keisha ran up, clutching 2 cups of lemonade she'd saved from the fair. She looked at me, eyes bright. "You know what Ms. Tasha said? She said you changed this place." I smiled faintly. "This place changed me first." "Then don't ever leave again. she said. I won't, I promised, though part of me knew promises like that are borrowed, not owned. Somewhere miles away, Daniel Carter sat in his SUV, watching the rain run down his windshield like veins. She's here, he muttered. Henry said nothing, because even he could tell. The woman Daniel was chasing no longer existed. And the one who did would never belong to him again. After the rain, Baltimore smelled of wet brick and fried food from the corner stand. The storm had rinsed the alleys clean, but it hadn't washed away the unease that trailed me like a second shadow. For days, I walked to work along different streets, changed my routes, my hours, my habits. Fear had manners. It never shouted. It whispered from just behind my shoulder. Aaron noticed first. You keep looking over your shoulder, he said one evening, rolling up his sleeves as he tallied supplies. Old reflex, I told him. It's hard to stop checking for ghosts. He didn't press. He just nodded toward the stack of invoices. Then let's give the ghosts something worth being jealous of. We worked side by side for hours, listening to the hum of the freezers and the distant music from the bar next door. Somewhere between the clatter of pans, I said quietly, You ever get tired of saving people? He smiled. I'm not saving anyone. I'm just reminding them they're still here. That night I wrote those words in my notebook. Still here. 2 words that felt heavier than my old last name. Across state lines, Daniel Carter's world was collapsing by the minute. His campaign manager resigned. 2 donors pulled their funding after an audit exposed misused grants. The media stopped calling him rising star and started calling him disgraced candidate. Vivian refused to leave her house. Reporters camped outside her gate. For the first time in her life, she was the story instead of the storyteller. When a journalist shouted through the iron bars, Did you help your son hide assets? She simply turned and walked inside. Her silence was an answer all its own. Daniel paced the study that had once been mine. Same polished floors, same chandelier light reflecting off the empty space where my piano used to stand. He poured whiskey until the bottle ran dry, muttering to the walls, She can't just vanish. People don't vanish. But they do, especially when they've already spent 10 years invisible. Meanwhile, I had begun to dream again, not of escape, but of building. During breaks at the kitchen, I drafted plans for a place called the Red Thread House, a refuge for women who'd lost everything, homes, names, faith in their own worth, a place where silence could heal instead of hide. I showed Aaron the sketches one night, lines and numbers drawn in pencil on napkins and scrap paper. He studied them like blueprints to a miracle. You're serious about this? He asked. I'm done surviving, I said. It's time to live for something. He smiled. Then we'll start small. 1 room, 1 roof. Tasha joined us, and soon the 3 of us were raising walls out of dust and hope. We painted over graffiti, repaired windows, cleared debris until our hands blistered. Keisha brought us lemonade every afternoon and declared herself official supervisor of smiles. We laughed, even when we were too tired to stand. At night, I would sit in the half-lit space that would one day become a dormitory and think about how the mansion in Greenwich had never felt as large as this broken building. Freedom doesn't need chandeliers, it needs purpose. But the past has impeccable timing. One Tuesday morning, Aaron burst into the kitchen holding a newspaper. Naomi, he said, breathless, then caught himself. Maya, he corrected softly. He set the paper down in front of me. Across the front page, Carter campaign collapses amid fraud probe. A smaller photo showed Daniel leaving a courthouse, face pale, eyes hollow. I read the headline twice, feeling nothing at first. Then something strange, relief tangled with grief. It wasn't joy, it was release. He was finally living in the chaos he'd built for both of us. Aaron studied me carefully. You knew this was coming. I knew the truth can only stay buried if the grave is quiet, I said. And he never learned how to be quiet. For a long while, we just stood there. The world was catching up with the man who once thought he owned it. And somehow, I was free without having to run anymore. That evening, I went back to the warehouse we were rebuilding. The walls smelled of fresh paint. Sunlight slid through the cracked windows in ribbons. I placed my notebook on a crate and wrote a single sentence across a clean page. When you stop hiding, you stop being hunted. Then I closed it and walked outside. For the first time in years, I said my real name out loud. To no one, to everyone. My name is Naomi Carter. The words didn't taste bitter anymore. They tasted like beginning. Miles away, Daniel's car sat idling in front of his mother's house. Vivian stepped out onto the porch, thinner, older, pearls traded for a plain sweater. "Let it go, Daniel," she said quietly. "You've already lost everything worth keeping." He looked at her, eyes bloodshot. "She took it all." "No," she answered. "She just showed the world what you really are." He said nothing. The engine roared, and he drove into the dusk without a destination. For once, no one followed him. Back in Baltimore, Aaron locked the kitchen for the night. We stood on the sidewalk watching the city lights flicker on. He turned to me. "So, what's next for Naomi Carter? Or Maya Ellis, or whoever you decide to be tomorrow?" I smiled, the smallest, truest smile. Tomorrow I build, and this time, no one gets to own the blueprint. Winter arrived early in Baltimore. The first snow didn't fall so much as drift, soft flakes that looked like forgiveness. Inside the half-rebuilt warehouse, a heater hummed unevenly, the scent of new paint mixing with the chill of metal beams. That space would soon become the Red Thread House. Not just a shelter, a promise stitched together from every broken thing I used to be. Tasha kept saying, "You're building hope with your bare hands." But it wasn't hope I was building. It was evidence. Proof that the woman Daniel Carter called lazy could raise an empire out of ashes. We worked through December nights under construction lights that buzzed like tired bees. Aaron handled permits and health codes, his calm voice convincing city clerks that miracles were routine paperwork. Tasha rallied the neighborhood, mothers, retired teachers, ex-nurses. Even Keisha came after school, painting hearts on the walls in bright red chalk. I used what I had left from the sale, not the whole fortune, just enough to anchor the dream. The rest I hid in the foundation's account, away from curious hands that might one day reach for it. Every dollar became beds, fresh sheets, counseling sessions, food. Every signature became a boundary between who I'd been and who I was learning to be. Aaron would catch me sometimes, staring at the plans taped to the wall. "You know," he said once, "most people try to forget where they came from. You turned it into a floor plan." "Maybe forgetting is what got me lost," I answered. He nodded, quiet understanding in his eyes. By January, the Red Thread House stood ready. 2 stories high, 12 rooms, one kitchen that always smelled like cinnamon. We held the opening on a freezing Sunday. No reporters, no donors, no speeches. Just neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, steam from their breath rising like prayers. I cut the ribbon with the same hands Daniel once said were too soft for real work. And when the door swung open, the sound that filled the hall wasn't applause. It was laughter. Laughter from women who finally felt safe enough to make noise. Later that night, when the crowd thinned, Aaron found me on the front steps. Snowflakes landed in my hair, melting faster than I could notice. He sat beside me, his coat brushing mine. "You ever think he's watching the news seeing all this?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "But that's not my story anymore." He smiled. "Then whose story is it?" "It's ours," I whispered. Every woman who was told she was too much or not enough. Every girl who learned to apologize for breathing. This house is theirs now. From down the block came the sound of children's laughter, Keisha's voice among them, clear and bright. I thought of that red yarn bracelet still on my wrist, faded now, threads fraying. It had survived rain, fear, and reinvention. So had I. Inside, the new residents were already settling in. Someone tuned an old radio. Aretha Franklin's voice spilled through the hall. Respect. The universe has a strange sense of humor. I stood in the doorway, looked at the faces, the warmth, the light. All of it built from the ruins of a life that once tried to erase me. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was hiding behind a name. Naomi, Maya, whatever came next. I was simply here, present, whole. And somewhere far away, in a mansion that no longer felt like his, Daniel Carter stared at a blank wall and realized that sometimes the greatest punishment isn't losing what you own. It's watching the one you underestimated build something you could never buy. The first knock came on a Wednesday afternoon. Not loud, polite, deliberate, the kind that doesn't ask permission because it assumes it already has it. Inside the red thread house, laughter echoed from the kitchen. Women were cooking, music was playing, life was happening. And then silence fell, as if the walls themselves had taken a breath. Tasha called out, "I got it!" But something in her tone made me turn from the hallway. Through the glass, a man's outline stood still against the gray daylight. Broad shoulders, tailored coat, too calm for this neighborhood. The world narrowed to a heartbeat. 10 years of marriage had given me an instinct. Even from behind glass, I knew the posture of Daniel Carter. I walked to the door before Tasha could. "Let me," I whispered. She hesitated, then stepped aside. When I opened it, the cold hit first, then his cologne, the same expensive blend of cedar and arrogance. For a second, neither of us spoke. He looked thinner, older, the gloss of his campaign photos stripped away. But his eyes, those calculating, restless eyes, were exactly the same. "Naomi," he said finally, voice low. "So it's true." I kept my hand on the doorframe. "You found what you were looking for." He gave a humorless laugh. "You've been playing hide and seek while my career burned." "You lit that fire yourself," I said evenly. "I came to make peace," he replied, but the muscles in his jaw betrayed the lie. He held out an envelope, official-looking, thick. "Sign this, and everything disappears. The press, the investigators, the lawsuits. I'll make it all go away." "I've spent a lifetime disappearing," I said quietly. "I'm done with that." His face tightened. "You think this place, these walls, make you free? You don't know what freedom costs, Naomi." "I do," I answered. $2 million and my silence. I stopped paying both. Behind me, Aaron appeared in the corridor, arms folded. Daniel's eyes flicked to him. "So this is where you landed. Charity cases and saviors." Aaron didn't move. "This building feeds people you never even saw, Mr. Carter. That's more than your campaign ever did." Daniel stepped closer. "You stole everything from me?" "No," I said, meeting his stare. "I took back what was already mine." The tension hung between us like smoke. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes landing on the dark wool of his coat, melting faster than they could settle. It made him look human for a fleeting moment, fragile even. "Why did you have to humiliate me?" he asked, voice breaking. "You did that yourself," I said. "All I did was stop pretending you were kind." He looked around at the red thread house, the laughter resuming faintly in the background, the smell of stew drifting from the kitchen. And for the first time, he seemed to understand that I wasn't a ghost haunting his legacy. I was a woman who had built one of her own. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. My old photograph, the one from Tybee Island, worn at the edges. "I kept this," he murmured. "You look happy there." "I was," I said, "because that was before you learned how to make me small." He stared at it, then handed it back. "No," I told him. "Keep it. Maybe it'll remind you who you could have been." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he turned, his shoes crunching over the thin layer of snow. At the gate, he paused and looked back. "I don't hate you," he said. "I know," I replied. "You never hated me. You just needed me to hate myself." He left without another word. The SUV pulled away, taillights bleeding red into the white storm until they vanished. Inside, the warmth of the building returned like breath after a long dive. Aaron stepped beside me. "You okay?" "I think so," I said. "I thought I'd feel fear again, but all I feel is space." He nodded, understanding. "Sometimes closure isn't a door slamming," he said. "It's just the sound of footsteps walking away." I watched the empty street for a moment longer, then closed the door gently. Behind it waited laughter, light, and the life I'd built from the ruins of everything he'd tried to own. And somewhere out in the storm, Daniel Carter drove into the blur of his own undoing, chasing a version of himself that no longer existed. For the first time in years, I slept without dreaming of escape. When morning came, I didn't feel hunted. I felt light. Outside, Baltimore was waking up, the smell of coffee from the corner shop, the scrape of brooms on icy sidewalks. Inside, the Red Thread House was alive with sound. Laughter, clattering dishes, music leaking from an old radio. Life was happening again, and I was part of it. Not as someone hiding, but as someone who had finally stopped running. Aaron found me in the office, sitting beside the window with a notebook on my lap. He handed me a steaming mug. "You didn't sleep much," he said. I smiled faintly. Sleep feels like a stranger I'm getting to know again. He leaned against the doorway. "He's gone, you know. Whatever he thought he could take back, he left with it." I nodded. "Daniel Carter doesn't understand what can't be owned." "What's that?" "Peace." The weeks that followed blurred into motion. The Red Thread House began to grow, organically, word spreading faster than flyers ever could. Women came from neighboring states, some carrying bruises that still hurt, others invisible wounds that never healed right. They came scared, exhausted, and hopeful in equal measure. Every time I opened that door, I saw myself reflected in their faces, the woman who once whispered apologies for her own existence. So I made a rule. No one here says sorry for surviving. Tasha took over operations. Aaron handled medical referrals. I focused on fundraising, letters, and a small book I'd begun writing in the quiet hours before dawn. It started as notes, little truths I'd never said aloud. But soon it became something else, a testimony, not about him, about me. I called it The Woman Who Sold Her Silence. When Aaron read the first draft, he didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "If the world reads this, they'll know who you are." "I want them to," I replied. "Not because I'm Naomi Carter, the politician's wife, but because I'm every woman who finally said enough." Spring came late that year, but when it did, the city seemed softer. One afternoon, Keisha ran into my office waving a letter. "It's from New York," she said. It was from a publisher, someone who'd seen an excerpt from my manuscript shared online. They wanted to publish it. I laughed until tears blurred the words. For once, my story wouldn't be whispered. It would be heard. At the launch months later, the publisher begged for glamour shots, for designer clothes, for a cover that screamed tragedy to triumph. I refused. The cover showed a single red thread winding through a cracked wall. Nothing else. No face, no mansion, just resilience. The book spread quietly at first, then everywhere. Book clubs, podcasts, universities. Women wrote letters. Men, too. Sons who said they understood their mothers differently now. The royalties went directly to the foundation. By summer, we'd opened 2 more shelters, one in Philadelphia, another in Richmond. Each one painted with the same mural, a single red thread, crossing the walls like a scar that healed instead of hiding. One night, months after the book's release, I sat alone in the courtyard. The almond tree we'd planted on the first day had taken root. Its small white blossoms trembled in the wind. I thought of all the names I'd worn: Naomi, Maya, Mrs. Carter, and realized they'd all been chapters, not prisons. For once, I didn't need to choose one. They all belonged to me. Aaron joined me, 2 cups of tea in hand. "You know," he said, "most people spend their whole lives trying to be seen. You disappeared and somehow became unforgettable." I smiled. Maybe disappearing was the only way to be found. He reached over, covering my hand with his. "Do you ever think about him?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But not with anger. Just a strange kind of gratitude. If he hadn't tried to break me, I'd never have learned how to rebuild." The wind carried a faint echo of the city, the distant hum of traffic, laughter, a bus rumbling down the street. Baltimore sounded like life continuing, indifferent to the past. I looked up at the stars and whispered, not for anyone to hear. Naomi Carter was the story he told, but this is the story I wrote. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like an author, of my choices, of my freedom, of my peace. A year passed before I noticed how quiet my heart had become. Not the silence of fear. This was something steadier, like the pause between waves when the sea finally rests. The Red Thread House was no longer a single building in Baltimore. It had multiplied, each new branch stitched together by women who'd once believed they were finished. Philadelphia, Richmond, Detroit, Atlanta, each city added another thread. Each wall carried the same mural, one red line crossing a cracked surface. No slogans, no faces, just endurance. Letters arrived every week, emails from strangers, handwritten notes slid under the door. One said, "I was going to leave him last night but didn't know where to go. Then I read your book. Now I'm packing." Another came from a man. "My mother used to hum that she was tired of being alive. Your story helped me understand what she meant." I kept them all in a box under my desk. On bad days, I'd open it and remind myself that the story I'd once written out of pain was now medicine. Aaron liked to joke that I had accidentally started a revolution. "You didn't run away," he said. "You started a map for anyone who needs to." "Maps don't tell you what's waiting," I answered. He smiled. Maybe that's the point. He was right. The world had started listening, and I no longer needed to whisper. When reporters came, I didn't hide. I spoke carefully, not about Daniel or Greenwich or scandal. I spoke about women finding their names again, about how dignity isn't a luxury, it's oxygen. And when I walked off those stages, I never looked for cameras. I looked for faces, the ones nodding quietly because they understood every unsaid sentence. Meanwhile, in a quiet rehabilitation center outside Hartford, another story was fading. Daniel Carter had fallen hard, campaigns gone, reputation shredded, the kind of man the news now called former. A mild heart attack had left him with a limp and too much time to think. Reporters stopped asking questions. Even his mother, Vivian, had vanished from the public eye. Once, he received a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a clipping, the front page of a magazine showing the grand opening of a Red Thread House in Detroit. Beneath the photo, a quote from me. "When you learn to forgive yourself, your enemies become irrelevant." He stared at it for a long time, then folded the paper and placed it inside a drawer. He never threw it away. Vivian visited only once after that. She looked smaller, her hair gray, her posture humble in a way I'd never seen. "Do you still blame her?" she asked him. He shook his head slowly. "I blame the man who believed love was a campaign," he said. She didn't reply, but a tear slid down her cheek. The first truth she'd ever allowed herself to show. Back in Baltimore, the tree in our courtyard bloomed again. Children from the neighborhood climbed its branches while their mothers laughed from the porch. Keisha was taller now, braces on her teeth, and a stack of notebooks under her arm. "I'm going to be a writer," she told me proudly. I smiled. "Then promise me one thing. Write what hurts, but finish it with what heals." She nodded, understanding beyond her years. Later that evening, she handed me a red ribbon tied to a folded sheet of paper. "It's a new story," she said, "about a girl who got lost but followed her own footprints home." I swallowed hard, unable to speak. Sometimes the universe replies through small voices. As dusk settled, I sat on the front steps with Aaron. The city buzzed softly, sirens far away, laughter close. He handed me tea, and for a while we said nothing. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" he asked. "Not really," I said. "I think about now, about roots." He glanced at the tree. "Then you've already planted enough." I smiled, watching the lights of the foundation glow through the windows. For the first time, I didn't see a refuge. I saw a legacy, one built not from revenge, but from resurrection. And as the night wrapped around us, I whispered into the warm dark, "May every woman who is told she's too much, too loud, too soft, too late, find a door like this one and walk through it. Because sometimes justice doesn't wear a courtroom robe or a headline. Sometimes it looks like laughter echoing from a house you built with your own hands." By the time the third spring came, the city knew my name again. Only now, it meant something different. It wasn't attached to a scandal or a husband or a mansion. It was whispered in clinics, schools, bus stations. "She's the one who started the red thread houses." And every time I heard it, I smiled, not from pride, but from relief. I'd finally become the kind of story I used to pray existed. The days at the foundation had their rhythm: morning meetings, evening laughter, midnight paperwork. Aaron had grown into a partner, not of romance, but of purpose. He always said, "Love doesn't have to hold your hand. Sometimes it just stands beside you, steady." Keisha published her first short story online, a tale about a girl who planted courage in a coffee cup and watched it grow into a forest. She printed it and handed me the first copy. "For you," she said shyly. I framed it and hung it on the office wall, right above my old photograph from Tybee Island. That image of me, arms outstretched to the ocean, no longer hurt to look at. Now, it looked like prophecy. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. Cream envelope, no sender. The handwriting, familiar. Daniel's. I stood there for a long time before opening it. Inside, 1 page, 3 sentences. "I watched your interview. You looked peaceful. I'm glad you found what I couldn't give you. You were right. Money without soul is just paper." I folded it neatly and placed it in the same box that held the letters from women who'd written to thank me. In that moment, his note didn't feel like an ending. It felt like punctuation. A full stop after a sentence I'd rewritten. That evening, I gathered everyone in the courtyard, the women, the children, the staff. The almond tree was in bloom again, white petals fluttering like confetti in the wind. I told them I wanted to read something. From my new book, the title, Threads That Don't Break. My voice was steady as I read. There was a time I believed silence was safety, but silence is a slow kind of death. I learned that when you speak, you don't just save yourself. You leave a map behind for someone else to find their way home. Freedom isn't walking away. It's choosing not to turn back. When I finished, no one clapped. They just stood, quiet, breathing, connected, each of us a piece of the same thread. Tasha wiped her eyes. Aaron placed a hand on my shoulder. Keisha whispered, "You did it." I smiled. "No, we did." That night, after everyone left, I stayed under the almond tree. The wind rustled its branches, scattering white petals across my lap like snow. The world felt still. I opened my notebook one last time and wrote, If anyone ever asks what became of Naomi Carter, tell them she finally learned how to exist without permission. Then I closed it, exhaled, and watched the stars appear one by one, quiet, unhurried, infinite. The final shot would fade from the red thread house courtyard to the worn photograph on my office wall. A younger me at the ocean's edge, laughing, fearless. The voiceover soft, reflective, grounded. Some stories don't end in triumph or tragedy. They end in truth. And truth, when spoken by a woman who once believed she was powerless, is the loudest sound in the world. Time didn't roar forward, it drifted. 5 years passed like pages turning in a soft wind. The world changed, the city changed, even the walls of the red thread house changed. Paint chipped, furniture replaced, laughter louder than ever. But some things stayed exactly the same. The mural on the front wall, the red line winding through the crack, still stood untouched. Visitors took photos of it every day. Some saw art. Others saw survival. But to me, it was both. Aaron had become the heart of the foundation. He handled the press now, smiling awkwardly during interviews, still wearing the same scuffed watch he'd owned since before I met him. He never took credit. He always said, "Naomi built the house. I just keep the lights on." Sometimes he'd stand in the courtyard after the evening shift, looking at the almond tree that now reached above the second-story windows. Its roots had spread beneath the pavement, cracking it slightly, but no one minded. We let the cracks stay. It reminded everyone what growth looks like when it refuses to die. Tasha ran the new branch in Richmond. She wore business suits now, but still kept her kitchen voice. Sharp, warm, commanding. She trained volunteers like soldiers, feeding hundreds every week. Every time she signed a report, she ended with 3 words. Still here, always. Keisha was 16 now, all braces gone and confidence in their place. She was writing her second book, a collection of stories by children who'd lived at the red thread houses. She titled it, The Homes We Built Inside Ourselves. When she sent me the draft, her dedication read, "For Naomi Carter, who showed me that broken doesn't mean finished." I cried for a long time that night, not from sadness, but from the strange peace that comes when you realize your story has become someone else's beginning. And Daniel Carter? History had quietly erased him. After the fraud trials ended, he moved to a small town near the coast, working as a substitute teacher under a shortened version of his name. Once in a while, someone recognized him. He never denied who he was. He just said, "I used to be a man who didn't know what mattered." Rumor said he planted a small community garden behind the local library. He tended it daily, never missing a season. And every spring he grew almond trees. No one asked why, but I knew. As for Vivian, she left her estate to charity before quietly disappearing from public life. The last trace of her was a check sent anonymously to one of our new shelters in Dallas, $50,000, signed only, "From a woman who finally understands." The red thread houses had grown to 11 cities. Thousands of women, children, and families had passed through our doors. We never turned anyone away. That was the rule. Every new branch started the same way. One door, one volunteer, one woman willing to believe again. When people asked for our mission statement, I always said the same line. We don't fix people. We remind them they were never broken. On the 5th anniversary of our first opening, Aaron organized a small gathering in the Baltimore courtyard. Former residents, staff, volunteers, all together again. The almond tree was covered in ribbons, each one holding a handwritten message. Some said thank you. Some said I made it. Some just said home. As dusk settled, Aaron asked me to speak. I hesitated. I'd said so many words over the years, lectures, interviews, keynotes. But this felt different. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about legacy. So I took the microphone and said simply, 5 years ago, I stood right here afraid that this place would crumble before it began. But it didn't. Because I learned something. Threads don't have to be perfect to hold. They just have to stay connected. The crowd was silent for a heartbeat. Then applause rolled through the air like a warm wave. I looked up and saw Keisha smiling, her red bracelet still on her wrist. Tasha wiping tears discreetly with her sleeve. Aaron nodding quietly from the side, eyes glistening under the lights. I took a breath and finished. Everything that happened before, every betrayal, every silence, was just the thread leading me here. And if this story ever finds you in your darkest hour, remember, you are the thread. You always were. That night, after everyone left, I sat beneath the almond tree. The branches swayed gently, white petals falling across my lap. I thought of the mansion in Greenwich, the woman I used to be, the envelope I once dropped in silence. If someone had told me then that the end of that life would be the beginning of this one, I would have laughed. But that's the quiet truth of rebirth. It never looks like fire. It looks like peace. As the camera of memory panned upward, stars flickering over Baltimore's rooftops, the voiceover closed softly, like a heartbeat fading into the night. Once upon a time, he said I disgusted him. Now I build homes for women who know their worth, and maybe that's the greatest revenge of all. Not destruction, but creation. Fade to black. The faint sound of a child's laughter echoes in the distance. Then silence. The screen fades in again for the final line, white text over the mural. The red thread never breaks.